well, I didn't know that what the joke was. It was just the murder joke that she was making. I don't know where she was.
But the way to analyze the data, as we say, there's more than one way to skin a CAT scan. Now, there's more than one way specifically to decide who's a pedophile. Now, of the people taking this, of the people coming in and participating in my studies, these were not regular, everyday, representative pedophiles, if there's such a thing that I can say. These are people who were willing to volunteer for the test. So of the pedophiles, these were relatively pro-social. They wanted to know why they were different. They, by and large, expressed very realistic, believable remorse, and as if this is some of them did it just for the money. They right out of jail and needed I think it was $200 for, just to get started again. And some of them, no, they wanted to know why they were different, and if there's something they could do to help us prevent there being another generation of this, they want to participate. So of these people, a large chunk of them would self-report pedophilia. And if someone tells me that they're a pedophile, except for my occasional OCD case, I believe them. If a sex offender against children tells me he's an actual pedophile, I believe him. So that's one way to analyze these data. The other is, of course, to use philometry itself, to use philometry directly, even if the person denies that they're a genuine pedophile. If the test says there is, guess which group you're going in. Okay, and there's more than one way to analyze the MRI data. One is a thing called automated parcellation. As I said before, the brain has different regions and different areas, and we essentially need to know the area or the volume of those chunks of brain, and then we compare the average sizes of those chunks of brain in one group versus the same equivalent chunk in the other brain. That's a way to do it. But because doing it by hand is not going to happen, it's automated. We now actually have Google, it's not Google, but it's Google-like software that will trace those pieces of anatomy for you. It's automated. And then calculate by the number of pixels in that, give you the area and the volume of that chunk. It's fascinating. And then the other one, the one that I'm going to show you today, is what we call voxel-based morphometry, VBM. Now, of course, everybody always has the same question: what the fuck's a voxel? And again, like a lot of this, languagey kind of stuff, it sounds, oh shit, what is it? It's not at all complicated. You know what a pixel is? Okay, because a pixel is regular screen. Now, imagine if instead of looking at a two-dimensional screen with pixels, you have a three-dimensional volume of pixels. You now have a volumetric pixel as a voxel. So each of the various points on the brain, including inside of it, each one of those is a voxel. So all voxel-based morphometry is studying the form of the brain point by point, voxel by voxel. Once demystified, it's really not complicated. Okay. So these are the technical jargon that my team of Vulcans use in order to perform the calculations with the computer. Now, when I first ran the study, exactly as you might imagine, the computer, series of steps, some of which have strange names, like one of which is skull stripping. They had me at stripper. Skull? So it turns out that even though the computer will automate the, point by point and the morphology and so on, something it can't do is figure out where the brain starts. So one of the parts we do by hand, the mouse by hand, is strip the skull away out of the image, then give it to the computer. So when the computer does it, it's only brain tissue that it's analyzing. So we had a team of research assistants, and there we are, stripping skulls. How many skulls you got? How many strips you got? Okay, So we started that, and as I said, when you compare two groups of these, the way all of these studies work are just basic everyday brain, plain brain tissue we just show in black and white and gray in order to show what's where, and then the significant differences between the two groups show up in color, and this is what I got. I didn't sleep for about 2 weeks. Just all of this time, all of this money, all of this effort, and nothing, 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 nothing. Big grant, end of my career. Well, I guess I could be somebody else's research assistant. But I had two really good research assistants. Now, in these days, everything that we knew about the brain was on the surface of the brain. In fact, today, all of the stuff that we think of as higher functions are all on the surface of the brain. It's essentially what makes them higher functions. The language areas, the visual areas are all in that thin, it's like 2 millimeters, gray matter around the surface of the brain. And if you remember what a neuron looks like, you have the brain, the neuron itself, the cell body, and that long tail-like axon, which carries the signal to either whatever other part of the brain it's going to, or down the spinal cord. So this is what I got. Again, all the gray. And in those days, everything was in gray, and I was looking for whatever patches on the surface of the brain might be different. No patches on the surface of the brain were different, and end of my career. However, these two RAs continue analyzing through the brain shit that nobody ever analyzes. The white matter. Fuck. There were these huge differences in these enormous swaths of white matter. And again, we're going back over 10 years ago now. Nothing is white matter. It's cabling tissue. Who cares? What in cabling tissue could reduce pedophilia, or much else for that matter? But there it was, plain as day. These huge tracts with a big ugly name. This is the superior occipitofrontal fasciculus of both hemispheres, and there's another big chunk. Again, you're looking at the left hemisphere. The only difference between the teal-colored areas and the magenta-colored areas are that the teal is in the left hemisphere and the magenta is in the right hemisphere. It's just easier to see that way. And if you're gay, you're not going to pick like blue and red. It's going to teal and magenta and robin's egg and cerulean. And that's what we should do with that FAS test. Right, if we had a gay test, as quickly as you can, name as many different shades of blue. Yeah, with straight men, I don't know, straight men can rarely get past 2. Like navy blue, light blue. A clever one will say baby blue if he's a father. That's really, by the time he hits cerulean, send him to me. And this is now exactly the same brain, but we're now kind of floating above the person, looking down on his head, like that. So teal is still left, magenta is still right. So these two huge C-shaped swaths that trace, as I say, superior occipitofrontal fasciculus in both hemispheres. That's the C-shaped part, and this extra big blob on the right side is the arcuate fasciculus of the right hemisphere. Nobody knows what it does. The arcuate fasciculus of the left hemisphere is fascinating. The arcuate fasciculus of the left hemisphere, and again, you would think that they would do the same thing, but for opposite parts of the body or some kind of specialization like verbal versus nonverbal. The regular arcuate fasciculus of the dominant hemisphere connects verbal speech, connects verbal production to verbal comprehension, or speech production to speech comprehension. There was like the Phineas Gage guy, there was a guy who just had I don't remember, it was epilepsy, it was intractable epilepsy. Now what they do with epilepsy, which doesn't answer to an anti-seizure medication, is sometimes they actually cut the nerves around it because epilepsy spreads. Not only, so when one set of neurons just starts blinking uncontrollably, which is essentially what epilepsy is, they're connected to other things, so that stimulation can get those going, and so on. This epileptogenic tissue then makes the tissue immediately surrounding it can also become epileptogenic. You got it. So what they used to do, so they would cut the nerves around it to keep it from spreading. And as you might imagine, that's a last resort. It's after you've tried everything, else. So there was this one guy who was suffering epilepsy, and it was in this area between the speech production and speech perception. It was in the arcuate fasciculus. So they cut the arcuate fasciculus. Okay? And a lot of what we learned about how the brain worked was from patients like these because we knew exactly where the damage was, and we could test them both before the surgery and after the surgery and see what abilities they gained because they were no longer as so severely epileptic, and what kind of things they lost because we had to take out or cut some of the tissue. So they did it with this guy who verbal production could no longer communicate with verbal perception. All these tests they gave him, normal math, normal verbal ability, normal comprehension, normal vision, normal movement. There was one task he couldn't do anymore. When somebody would ask him, repeat after me, once upon a time, and he would say, a long, long time ago. He understood me. His speech comprehension is working. His verbal comprehension is working. His answer is lucid, logical, but he could not repeat the words. Speech production was no longer connected to speech perception. The idea had to take the long way around comprehension. The word got lost, but the idea was still with him. He still had the concept of what once upon a time, because the rest of the association, tissue, memory, all of that was working, but there was no direct connection between remember these words and just spit them out again. He could only reform the idea, but he couldn't reform the words. That's the arcuate fasciculus in one hemisphere. No clue what the arcuate fasciculus in the what the arcuate fasciculus does in the other hemisphere, because verbal production and verbal comprehension are only in the dominant hemisphere. So what do they do in the non-dominant hemisphere? Time for little future me that'll be his, her, there. It's mystery. So as I say, we do not know what the arcuate fasciculus does. But because male-female stuff, or one of the big differences, pedophilia is one of the things that only happens to men, verbal ability is one of the huge differences between men and women, it makes me wonder, is there some association? Is there something about how the brain sexually differentiates, goes wrong in men, which is why we only see pedophilia in men. Women don't undergo a masculinization process. There's nothing to go wrong. If the problem is in the masculinization process, which every fetus does, every fetus starts as female, even when it has Y chromosomes. The Y chromosome is essentially dormant until late first, early second trimester. I know, we are just... I need one more grant or 3 little me's or to be 20 years younger. So what on earth could the cabling tissue, even though I have suddenly saved my career because I had clever research assistants studying things where we had no reason to think that there would be any differences, but found them, how could connective tissue produce pedophilia? I'm not quite sure how wasn't quite sure how connective tissue could produce anything, but it does. Again, this is one of those, no clue. No fucking clue. No clue. I'm sitting there sweating. At least my career is saved. I have something publishable, even if I have to publish it in Ron Longevin's journal. Actually, I have to take that back, because at this point, I think we were about 10 minutes away from it being my journal. I get that free get out of jail card. That's why I feel like I can talk. Yeah, I can make fun of its early beginnings of the journal. So, it's a little more self-effacing than if somebody else says it. I haven't had that conversation with Mike Cito yet. The current editor, who's fantastic, by the way. I love him to tears. Has anyone met his wife and kid? Also adorable. Right. Oh, right. So what on earth could this mean? Especially this, what could connective tissue in general mean? And this particular connective tissue, as I said, could not make heads or tails out of, could not come up with any kind of a theory that made sense of this. It was one of those, I just have to, push it aside. I had another stack of reading that I needed to get to, things and reviews I was behind on, so I just needed a break. And I'm just catching up on my reading. Until it was one of those, wait a second. And all of a sudden, what I was reading made sense of my own data. What I was reading was another study, was a study using now fMRI in regular everyday people, not pedophiles, not sex offenders, just regular everyday people, showing them porn while they were in an fMRI scanner. It was fMRI functional, so we're looking at what parts of the brain light up when these people were watching porn. Now, it's a fascinating question. I'd be naturally curious. And in these days, we say, oh, well, the sex center would light up. And once again, dead wrong. Dead wrong. Dead. Not only was it not the sex area, not only was it not the sex center lighting up, there was no fucking sex center. There is no one point that lights up when somebody sees something sexy. In retrospect, we should have predicted exactly what parts of the brain would light up. And in retrospect, again, we just should be smacking ourselves in the head for what idiots we were. The areas of the brain that light up are vision, again, hormone control, mirror neurons. Remember those? Old experiment where research, again, clever research assistant, was having lunch, monkey was attached to whatever the experiment was, there were electrodes into the brain, research assistant went to pick up whatever food, apple, banana it was, the equivalent area of the monkey's brain lit up. Not from the monkey moving, it was motor experiments, and normally, the electrodes were in the motor control parts of the monkey's brain. The monkey's brain was responding not according to its motor movements, but the motor movements the monkey was seeing the research assistant making. That's how they got the name mirror neuron. It's not just my left arm neurons controlling my left arm. My left arm neurons also light up when I see somebody else moving their left arm. The brain does not work the way it feels like it works. Anyway, so the mirror neurons also light up during sex. And again, in retrospect, duh. Social areas, social neuroscience areas light up. Again, in retrospect, we should have predicted each of these areas to light up. We didn't. But all of these areas that light up, it forms a sex network rather than a sex center. Well, all of these areas that light up when somebody sees something sexy, this network is all cabled through, say it with me, the superior occipital frontofasciculus. So it's not that there's a problem in a sex center, it's there's a sex network. And if the network is not cabled together correctly, instead of saying hot versus not, or go on a date with this one, nurture and protect that one, and run away from that one, it's as if the social instincts are literally cross-wired. So when it perceives the stimulus that represent child, head, proportionate to body, eyes relative to face, the subtle cues that we perceive only subconsciously, mainly subconsciously, when the brain is perceiving those stimuli, it's triggering the sexual instincts instead of the parental avuncular instincts, like a literal cross-wiring. That's what I said. I don't know if it's true, but gosh, it's such a compelling theory, I'd be surprised if it's not. It almost seems straightforward now in retrospect. Humans have multiple social instincts. Again, that's not a mystery. So really, as I say, some of them are obedience, obey the alpha, run away if you can't overwhelm it. So it seems like whatever tissue it is that's supposed to be cabling this together, if that white matter is underdeveloped, you can almost think of it like a myopia. It cannot so easily differentiate what it's supposed to respond, which way to what. And as I say, so they are experiencing a sexual reaction. I often want to say instead of, and this is one of the pedophiles who hate me, this is one of the things that they point out to me, and I almost have to give them credit for. Rather than, lost it. That means it's lunch. Rather than responding, where I usually say, instead of responding with the avuncular nurturant instincts, I say instead. They think I should say in addition. They report, and I have no reason really to say that they're wrong. They say that they do experience the desire to protect, nurture, but for them, they also experience it as erotic love, rather than instead. And so even though they hate me, I can't say they're wrong on this one. Their experience of it, from their point of view, it is genuinely romantic. We forget that. I forgot that. I see this as sexual because that's the part that's dangerous. But to get to understand them, even though it's, decide on your own whether it counts as a psychopathology, but their feelings of the affection and of the, barring the psychopaths, their emotional reactions are genuine. And we completely ignore them even though from their point of view, that's what's driving them, is the affection, not the sex. The sex part is what we see, but is not necessarily their experience of it. Now we're ready for lunch. Great, thank you.
Isn't that the same as a teleophile who develops affection for a peer-aged?
Yes, it is. And we just forgot.
Sexual attraction?
Yes, and it's when we're talking about sex offenders, we completely forgot that. We only see the sex part, the criminal part. We don't reflexively or haven't reflexively seen the emotional part because that seems too weird to us. But for them, that's the core of it. Great, thank you. See you back after lunch. 1 o'clock. So this is where we were in 2010. And now even this is getting old. So these were the 3 studies. I'll talk slow until everybody gets back. We had the Schiffer, Schultz, and the shithead. The way that I remember out of Schiffer and Schultz, Schiffer was the frontal lobe theorist and Schultz was the temporal lobe theorist. And the shithead was the one with white matter. So that's, as I say, that's where we were in 2010. So on one hand, okay, there's some evidence for it being in the brain, but, well, 3 different studies with 3 different sets of results. So then became the race to replicate. The challenge was on. It was the New York Jew versus the Germans. The Germans teamed up. And so, well, when I'm in Canada, I talk about the Canadians versus the Germans. So really the thing is well, they both reported finding areas in gray matter, either the frontal lobe gray matter or the temporal lobe gray matter. And I said, nope, no gray at all. This is actually a white matter thing. Usually I have a slide up here of Gandalf the Gray and Gandalf the White. So the first study to try to replicate this was the Popel study. Now, Popel tried to replicate specifically the gray matter areas. He did not have the statistical power or the kind of MRI that would tell him anything about white matter. And you can see now the size of his study, 20 people including the control group. So smaller even than the original studies. Now, what Popel did is still legitimate. What Schultz and Schiffer did, even though they had small samples, they tested, entire lobes, which are made up of many different components. And as I keep saying, each of those is its own t-test and another chance at rolling the dice. Popel didn't need to look at the entire temporal lobe or the entire frontal lobe. Popel only needed to look at the 3 specific areas that Schultz reported, and then I'm holding up 17 fingers, and the 17 areas that Schiffer looked at. He only needed to look at those very specific areas to see if they would come out again. So because he's performing fewer t-tests, he has less of a problem about worrying about his multiple t-tests. So out of the 3 temporal and the 17 frontal areas, he found none of the limbic system areas came out again, and out of the 17 frontal, only 1 came out again, which to me is none came out again. Which brings us to the New Yorker. Now, what Popel did, again, he was looking specifically at the gray matter areas and looking specifically at the ones that had been previously reported. I now wanted to look at white matter. Now, originally, the technology that I used, the regular VBM stuff, was not designed to look at white matter. It can do it. It could do it decently. It could say in this basic blob, which we know is located in white matter, is less dense or different in its density from in the control group. But, as I say, regular MRI is not particularly well attuned to the fibrous tissue that white matter is. So there were the 2 studies, and we came out, again, roughly at the same time. The technology that we used for the white matter is now called diffusion tensor imaging, or DTI. Now, DTI is an MRI. Magnetic resonance imaging is, theoretically, any kind of image that you take when in the magnetic field. And there are many different types of ways, as I said earlier, that we can tune the various fields and the radio pulses and so on in order to get back different kinds of echoes from the brain, which tell us different things about the brain. DTI is the one that we use because it is exquisitely well-tuned to white matter, specifically to properties of white matter that the rest of the brain doesn't have. Again, DTI is a kind of an MRI. It doesn't use radioactivity. It doesn't use X-rays. It just uses magnetism. But what makes it different... sorry, took out some of the slides. But what makes it different is the way that it measures the differences in water. Now, like I said before, in a regular MRI, in a regular pool of water, a water molecule can move in absolutely any direction, and relatively freely. It's just water. When the same water molecule is in gray matter, that big tight bundle of tissues and cell membranes and so on, it's relatively difficult for a water molecule to move in any direction because there are all these barriers and so on preventing its diffusion or movement. If you picture white matter, remember a nerve, a bundle of the axons that come off the tail of a nerve cell, and they come in tight bundles. In those, water can move pretty easily along the fiber because there's nothing in the way. The thing is meant to transmit signals from end to end. But crisscrossing across fiber bundles is difficult. That's where the cell membranes are. A water molecule would have to move out of a cell into another cell, out of that cell. That's difficult to do. So the water is moving easily in one direction, but with more difficulty in the other 2 directions. It's 3-dimensional. So it moves along the fiber, but not crisscrossing the fiber quite as easily. What an MRI does is measure the diffusion of water. We now have a difference in how easily water can diffuse in one direction versus the other direction. So what we set the MRI up to do in the DTI is to tell us the direction of the water instead of the location of the water. So instead of saying there's a big pool of water here but not there, we just say of the water that's here, it's moving most easily in whichever direction it's moving easily in. So we pick a seed point in the brain and essentially set the computer to which way is that water molecule, are those water molecules moving most easily, and the computer then will identify this direction. We don't know if it's left to right or right to left, but we know it's in that plane. Once we know that point, our seed point to the end point, now we say what direction is the water moving from that end point, and from that end point, and from that end point, and we can voxel by voxel trace the entire nerve from beginning to end. So now when we compare two groups, DTIs, we get to compare how well packed that movement is. In a tightly packed, healthy, juicy set of nerves, the fibers will again be dense, and we will get a very sharp difference between water molecules moving along versus across. In a set of tissue that's less well developed, or there were fewer nerves, or they're not, remember the myelin sheath, the stuff that goes around a nerve? If there's less myelinization of the tissue, so there's less barrier, the water again can move more freely. So there's less of a there's less of a difference between how easily the water can move along versus across the fiber. And that's what DTI does. Because that's how white matter is structured, it gives us, as I say, an exquisitely good picture of what's going on in the white matter, of the actual structure, size, and health of the white matter. So that was our next experiment, to see if I can find differences in the white matter now that I have a fucking clue what I'm looking for. Thinking I have a clue of what I'm looking for. So just like before, another MRI study, but this one's using, this one uses DTI instead of MRI. We were laughing before how the MRI goes, eh, eh, eh. A DTI goes, doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. I have absolutely no why. I have no idea why. It drives me nuts, but that's the sound it makes. All right, so these were my pedos versus controls. Now, this is one of those, I kind of regret it. I gave in when I shouldn't have, in one of those, you know, like a comedian who says something and there's a political backlash, so they take it back and then decide, you know, I really shouldn't have taken it back. I was right in the first place. Yeah, that's what I did with this one. After that first study, remember I said I compared the pedophilic offenders with non-pedophilic offenders. So only the pedophilia was different between the two groups. So many people did not understand that and saying, where's your healthy control group? Even though there doesn't need to be one, I just finally fucking backed down and put in a healthy control group. There, everybody happy. Made no goddamn difference, but now I can say that I did it. Anyway, so as you can see, so these groups were different in years of education, which again is not a surprise. We know that from the earlier studies, but otherwise these groups were very well matched. Except of course for the pedophilia itself. Now in doing DTI studies, step number one is locate the main cluster where the fibers in that area appeared to be different than in other areas. So the ratio of how easily water can go in one direction versus the other direction relative to that ratio on average in the other group. And I got this strip towards the front. Those are the points at which the diffusivity, diffusion, the water, movement of water, the diffusion of water was different in that area versus all of the other areas. So step two then is then take each of those points, say, and what's the next most likely point where that leads? And what's the next most likely point that leads? And then it goes down, and bifurcates. And so we traced all of those out in order to ask, okay, and when the last area for that, when we get to the last brain area that the white matter pointed to, tell me what that is. So that way I will have started with my first area where something was different and traced it to the end, so I know that even though there's no difference at the end, I only know that that's the end point of the thing that I did find was different. So that first big blob is where things are different. These are the mass of fibers that come out of it, and that mass of fibers then land there. Look familiar? The exact same set of areas that form the, for lack of a better phrase, although now we're kind of calling it that, the sex response network. The same, completely different set of subjects, different control group, different technology, exactly the same result. There's a chunk of connective tissue that's different in pedophiles, and the chunk seems to be the chunk that variously connects together the various parts of the sex response network in order to function as a single coherent network instead of just random points unto themselves. So again, twice in a row, completely different subjects, different technologies, different research assistants even, and the same result. Come on, this has got to be. Meanwhile, the Germans can't find the same thing twice. So the basic idea here is, okay, this is a replication. I found the same thing in white matter using completely different technologies. That's about as far as a single scientist can take a finding. Once you've replicated it yourself, okay, fine, has to happen. But really, I need somebody else, not too dumb. Or at least I need them to be smart enough to know I'm right. So then another gang from the German team, that's what they tried doing. They were also, again, trying to find, now specifically, whether there were any differences in white matter. So they used very similar, they used the identical technologies, but they found no group differences. I know they're there. I found them twice. And the Germans keep finding nothing. So what does it mean when they look at this and find nothing? Does it mean there's nothing there, or does it mean that their telescopes aren't powerful enough? And then, of course, how does that play out when you have a strong political desire where people either want to prove one or prove the other, and they just cite, here we go again, whichever set of studies happens to match whatever it is that they want everybody to think. Oh, shoot. I'm sorry, I'm missing two slides. They found no group differences. However, they did do another study after that one. This one using what's called resting state fMRI. Called resting. I just want to make sure I didn't accidentally have a slide in this later instead of sooner. I just rearranged these on the plane on the way here. Anyway, resting state fMRI. Remember fMRI. fMRI is the one where we're actually measuring the amount of activity in different parts of the brain, because as the brain is active, it lets the blood vessels grow. We detect that as water. That tells us that that part of the brain is more active. Now, resting state fMRI can be thought of as the opposite of fMRI, where with regular fMRI, they're in the machine, we're showing them porn or giving them verbal tasks or asking them to remember their things, and then we watch which parts of the brain activate as they're watching porn, as they're remembering things, as they're singing a song, whatever it is, so we can put one and one together. What resting state fMRI does is what's called functional connectivity. Imagine the brain at rest. Imagine an opportunity to get to rest. And so the brain is just kind of, remember milk, daydreaming, really not doing anything in focus. And the brain is just kind of maintaining, reconsolidating memories, just doing background stuff. So the brain is never inactive, even during sleep. The brain is never inactive. So imagine, of each of those points in the brain, imagine a factor analysis of the activity levels for each point. In factor analysis, all that is taking all of the variables, and the algorithm clusters those variables together to say, these variables go up and down together. Instead of just two variables that correlate, so they go up and down together, factor analysis takes whole bunches of variables and say, these 6 go up and down more or less together. That doesn't go up more or less together. And we cluster large numbers of variables into smaller numbers of variables. Same with a brain. If out of the 1.2 million voxels in the brain, in a standard brain scan, what if we factor analyze those activity levels so the points that go up in activity together get clustered with each other, and the ones that function independently go up and down together. So all of the if the person is resting, even though they're not perceiving anything, the vision areas, the whole vision areas increases and decreases in activity together. So if I factor analyze the entire brain, I get a cluster which we now know as the visual area, acoustic area, verbal area, and on and on and on. So in resting state fMRI, we again look at essentially that factor analysis just to see which brain points go up and down together. Usually in a brain, adjacent points go up and down together. Adjacent points are, usually part of the same structure rather than in adjacent structures, so we can tell by physical position that they go up and down together. They are structurally connected. You remember, the fiber, one neuron will make lots of contact with the adjacent fiber. That's how, with the adjacent neuron, that's how the neurons contact each other. And then the long tail when it needs to talk to something far away. When we do the factor analysis, the clump comes together because they're all responding to the same stimulus if we are in, for example, the vision area. And then whatever that area connects to, it's responding to the signals from here. So again, they will go up and down together. In a healthy brain, we get background activity. 80% of the variance overall in the brain is just the entire brain going up and down in activity together, and then there are sub-circuits within it. What one of the German teams did then was to look at the resting state functional connectivity of the pedophiles. And so just like the other experiments, but just like another fMRI but with no task, they're just in the bore, and then we factor analyze that activity or those activity levels instead of looking at the structure. And what the final German team found was a difference in the now functional connectivity. Any guesses where? In the chunk of the brain that otherwise cables together the various parts of the brain that respond to sexual stimuli. Finally, one of the German studies replicated me. So now I like Germany again. Okay, the functional studies. Now, the functional studies, as I described before, the basic physics is just like a structural MRI, but now I'm looking at activity levels because I'm looking at how much water/blood is in a particular part of the brain. So here we are subatomic once again. Here we are seeing our brains once again. Oh, I did have these. I'm sorry, I just moved the slides later. This was just to show during an fMRI, we have, when they're relatively inactive, we have relatively constricted veins and arteries, and then relatively expanded veins and arteries when that area of the brain is active. And so these are the areas of the brain that we can look at according to how much the water levels have increased / the blood levels have increased over time, and that's what tells us then the amount of activity. This first thing, the resting state, is what I was just describing as we factor analyze all the activity levels all together. The other kinds of questions that we can ask are just as if not more fascinating. This is one where we have somebody perform a couple of tasks, one of which is of course, a regular control task, and we subtract the activity levels all over the brain when they're doing the task versus the activity levels in the brain when they're not doing the task. I have to rotate it to fit. And we subtract point by point by point by point by point to see where activity levels have increased and in many cases have decreased. And that's what tells us what part of the brain is involved in whatever that activity was. And then, so once we know what the brain activity levels are, we get our functional conductivity data, but we also get to start addressing these two much more practical questions. Do pedophiles and teleophiles, is it the same parts of the brain that light up when I show them the porn of their preference? Or does a different set or overlapping and different set of brain areas light up when I show somebody porn of their preference? And then, probably the most practical and easily imaginable important clinical questions, can I use an fMRI or MRI as a phallometric test? Can I use it as a diagnostic test? If brains light up only when you're seeing the thing that you're into, well, the logic should be straightforward. Just like with phallometry, I show them what they're into, I show them something else, and I measure what it is that they give me the biggest responses to. Okay, so the first set of studies, as I say, were the resting state studies. This is where the slides that I thought I lost have gone. So the first set of studies, again, there were a bunch of them, and just like with the others, different people were looking at different parts of the brain. Some were trying to look at the entire brain, which requires a very large sample in order to compensate for the number of t-tests that you're running. Others were relatively small and looking only at specific parts of the brain. The Habermeyer was one of the smallest one. And they were looking specifically at they were comparing heterosexual pedophiles with heterosexual controls. Fine, they were looking at the whole brain, so they're really stretching thin with the number of people versus the number of their comparisons. The Cargill study, very similar, but they were looking at DMN is the default mode network. Remember I said if you factor analyze the brain, 80% of it is just background, whole brain active, whole brain not active. That's the default mode of the brain. So it's a measure of how much the default mode network is cabled together properly so the whole brain is going up and down systematically as it should. Or if there's a general problem in connectivity, then the brain's activity levels are going to be a bit more patchy. The various parts of the network are not as tightly cabled to each other as they should be. Anybody say Wi-Fi? Then Popel, again, same Popel as before, did another very interesting study, but instead of looking at specific pedophiles, he actually did this by looking at otherwise archived data. And then my own study, which I will get to. Okay, so I'd like to point out once again, if you run a goddamn study on practically nobody, you're going to get results that are practically meaningless. I'm publishing studies, with triple and quadruple the goddamn sample size they have, which means, of course, I publish half the papers that they do. Who's the better scientist? Now, when you apply for a grant, do they look at your sample sizes? No. They count the number of your fucking papers. So far as the grant committee is concerned, the one who keeps getting the goddamn right answer doesn't score as well. Anybody want to ask again why I'm leaving CAMH? Me, bitter. Okay, one small bitter rant. As much as I often do make fun of CAMH, it's not just CAMH, although they have their lion's share. The way society treats science and research in general. You can spend as much time as you want, get it reported in a top journal, you could say it on CNN, fake news, finding done. What the fuck's the point? We're going to seek knowledge in a society that doesn't care about knowledge? See ya. My rant. And universities cowardly and relatively sudden refusal to defend free speech. Fuck you all. You all had one job. Psychiatrists, psychologists can make double, triple the money in private practice at a university. We're going to go to, you want me to teach at a university and I'm not allowed to say what the science says because somebody doesn't like it? Fuck you. And do you know how much money these administrators get for just kowtowing to the lowest common denominator? I warned you it was a rant. Okay. To whom else can I preach? Okay, so again, that was really just to point out the sample sizes, because it is a large phenomenon that people tend not to pay attention to, and we see it very, very strongly in these kinds of data. Now, to make a long story short, in my own study, I replicated my own basic finding that, in this chunk of matter that was different between the two, it once again seems to trigger the sex response network. In these two studies, the Cargill study was very interesting because they compared pedophiles who had been abused with pedophiles who had not been abused. And they found that they also differed. Can't say I'm surprised. We kind of know that, having suffered abuse does itself interfere with brain growth. There's no particular reason yet to say that there's anything about the specific sexual interaction that seems to change the brain. Rather, it seems to be the stress involved with covering it up and not being able to tell anybody, or that the pedophile is targeting kids who are already in difficult circumstances, who are already in chaotic households, and so are kind of more lower hanging fruit. They're easier, to target because they have less supervision and less going on for them. So when we separate the sample, I think that's what really we're seeing, rather than the pedophilia itself. And Popel, as I say, is the one who actually used archived data in order to look at the general patterns of connectivity. And God bless the boy. The present results indicate functional connectivity within brain areas that serve to identify sexually relevant stimuli. This confirms the disconnectivity hypothesis proposed by the shithead from New York. So when we put them all together, again, these were the structural studies of pedophilia. So we have, going from the top, 3 OIs, but not really replicating in the temporal lobe. 17 alleged ROIs in the frontal lobe, 1 replicated, and 1 out of 17 to me is still pretty random. Popel was the one then who showed that none of the frontal lobes replicated, and only none of the 3 limbic replicated, and only 1 of the 17 frontal ones did. The Cantor white matter study using DTI, again, replicated that there's a disconnectivity in the sex response network, and then Gerwin found no basic differences. The resting state studies, so we're now talking fMRI, looking at, basically what parts of the brain go up and down together. Habemeyer found general lack of cohesiveness, that the brain was not functioning cohesively as much as it should. So it might be a general pattern of poor connectivity, and the pedophilia, if the strongest disconnection is in the pedophilia-related stuff, that's the symptom we see. If the person had poor connections, but the poorest connections were in another part of the brain, we'd see a different set of symptoms, and they'd have never ended up in my lab to begin with. Popel's analysis replicated my own findings, and my own findings replicated my own findings. So, again, so in the resting state study is the factor analysis. Everything goes up and down together or not. The other kind was the task-based studies, where we give people 2 or more tasks, and we look at what's different in activation levels in the 2 different parts of the brain. Literally, and it's even called a subtraction technique. There is nothing magical to it at all. And it allows us to answer the question, does a pedophile's processing of a stimulus differ at all from a teleophile's processing of that same stimulus? And this has been tried over and over and over again. As you might imagine, if you have access to a sample of pedophiles who are willing to undergo such tests, it's relatively easy. They're watching adults, they're looking at kids, and you just see when the parts of the brain light up. By now, we have figured out which parts of the brain light up when you show people different kinds of erotica. So we could look, with a more hypothesis-driven technique for selecting where in the brain to look, instead of the kind that requires large samples, because we're looking at the entire part of the brain. So as I say, it's relatively simple, and some of these studies have been mixed in quality. Like way up on top, the Walter study compared the pedophiles with healthy controls. A little oversimplified. Again, the better design would be to compare the pedophiles who are offenders with non-pedophiles who are also offenders, but they failed to do that. The next two Schiffer studies divided their heterosexual samples from their homosexual samples, that is, the offenders against adult men and the offenders against, these were non-offenders, regular, everyday, non-offending gay men with offending pedophiles, and regular, everyday, non-offending heterosexual men with heterosexual pedophiles. Two studies, because of course you get two papers that way instead of one study with two samples in it. Who's the better scientist? But again, they also used healthy controls instead of offender controls, so it's not clear to whom to attribute the differences that they found. Popel did it correctly. He actually compared the pedophiles with people who committed non-sexual offenses. Habermeyer made the same error. Ponseti made the same error, and Knott did something slightly different. But the bottom line to each of these studies, despite any errors that they had, they either found no findings or they found identical findings. That the parts of the pedophilic brain that light up when you show them what they're into are the very same parts of the brain that light up when you show a teleophile stimuli depicting adults. So there doesn't seem to be any observable difference in how the brain processes these stimuli. It seems to have this, as I say, cross-wiring or short circuit when it does process it. But we have not found any difference in nurturing parts of the brain, in how much they light up, or in how much the sexual parts of the brain light up. They seem to light up differently only in what provokes them, not in what their actual response is. Okay. Then that brings us to whether an fMRI can be used to diagnose the same way as a phallometric test can. Now, as you can imagine, with a regular phallometry, we just show them the various stimuli and we see what they react to. fMRI does the same thing, but instead of measuring the little head, we're measuring the big head. And of course, the big head is more complicated for some of us, in that, it's the same dozen areas, so we're watching that set of dozen areas come and go, no pun intended. Now, this study, again, because it's an important and relatively straightforward question, there have been several researchers who have been trying to answer this. The first one, I do not, for the life of me, understand how he structured it this way. It was the Sartorius study. Okay, this is before we really were talking a lot about a sex response network. Only just before we were talking about a sex response network. So Sartorius didn't have a clear idea of where in the brain to look at. I mean, that is where to drop his probe in order to say, tell me if this point in the brain is increasing in activity when I show the person whatever stimulus. So he had to take a guess. Well, he was guessing at where the sex center might be. We now know there is no sex center. He guessed at the amygdala as the seat of many of the core basic emotions, and it is indeed strongly involved with the 4 Fs. So he was not crazy in what he picked, but he picked it on a guess rather than some empirical finding that said this location. The other thing he did, which I still do not understand, he compared homosexual pedophiles, so abusers against boys, but compared them with heterosexual controls. Okay, so even if he does find a difference, to what do we attribute the difference? The pedophilia or the homosexuality? Right, I don't know why this study got published. Don't ask me to whine again. Where that can count, however, where I can give him some slack, is that he wasn't necessarily trying to make some generalizable statement that would apply to all pedophiles or all teleophiles. He was looking a little bit more, he was testing the equipment, actually. He was testing the equipment. So he wanted to find two sets of stimuli that were as different as possible from each other. So I think I've never met him, but I think from his point of view, the attraction to boys is his definition of as opposite as possible as men, attraction to men, because we're crossing both sex, male versus female, and we're crossing age, old versus young. So I think that's why he did it. What we do know now, however, is, remember the earlier graphs from before? Girl is not the opposite of man. Woman is the opposite of man. Boy and girl are actually very similar. Change a haircut, change the outfit, it's hard to tell a boy from a girl. Now, that would also explain, tangent, that would also explain why we have a disproportionate number of homosexual pedophiles. I mean, it's more than 10, it's not really 10% of men are gay. I'm not exactly sure where that rumor got started. It's about 2 or 3%. But it's way more than 2 or 3% of the pedophiles prefer boys to girls. It's, roughly a third. Roughly a third are into girls, roughly a third are into boys, and roughly a third don't care. Now, of course, if one is homophobic, that is a very easy jump to say, aha, this is why it's associated with homosexuality. And if I try my best to be fair to the thinking of that time, I can't say that that's irrational. The much more logical, but it takes less homophobia, conclusion is that because boys and girls don't look very different, there is just much less distinction in the mind of the pedophile between the two. If you're an adultophile, male and female is very different. We distinguish very much. If you're just into the kids, the male-female doesn't make so much of a difference. It really does not take that much more imagination, fantasizing that the kid is your optimal kind of kid. So I think that that's why we find a difference in the proportion of homosexual, heterosexual in the pedos versus the hets. Just my guess. Okay, so that's what Sartorius did, and what he found was about 67% sensitivity and 67% specificity. Remember, the phallometric test itself had about 60-ish percentage sensitivity, the direct phallometric test, and 95-ish percent specificity. The way he worked out the numbers, it came out about two-thirds, two-thirds. So the sensitivity, presumably, about the same. Fine. The specificity, you can see the danger here, where in our version of the volumetric phallometric test, we only had about a 4% false positive rate. About 4% of the people whom we said were pedophilic actually weren't. With him, it's about a third. Right. So even though our sensitivity is about the same, fine, I would be willing to use this sensitivity with a good specificity, but I would not be willing to use the sensitivity with a bad specificity. It's not worth misdiagnosing so many people as pedophiles in order to get the two-thirds that I would get. The other problem with that number, and a lot of phallometric studies make the same mistake, he used admitters. Now, when you're asking for volunteers to come test a test, of course, it's going to be the admitters who are by far much more likely to do it. They're more willing to do it. They're generally more pro-social, and at that point, they don't have anything to lose. The problem with it is that there's no point testing for pedophilia in somebody who already admits to being a pedophile. Generally, almost always, the clinically relevant question is whether somebody who is denying that they're a pedophile actually is. We need to know what the sensitivity and specificity would be among the deniers, because that's the only clinically relevant question. There are phallometric labs which have made exactly the same mistake when trying to express or calculate the sensitivity and specificity of their phallometric tests. They will say, we are able to detect 80%, we have a sensitivity of 80% of admitters. Well, if you're going by admission, you started with 100%. So to me, 80% means you've lost a bunch, not that you're good. If you are able to detect 80% of pedophiles among pedophiles who deny being pedophiles, now you have something. But that's what a lot of these phallometric tests are doing. They have run their numbers against the admitters, but they are making all of their clinical reports on deniers. Right. Now, and I haven't gotten a call from a defense attorney for that one yet. Oh, maybe I need to make a new business card. Anti-fallows, for a change. Okay. The next study, the Ponsetti study. Basically the same idea. He did it with a larger group. He was different. Instead of using the whole body like Sartorius did, he used just faces. He was looking just to see if people would respond differently to faces of boys versus girls. 88% sensitivity, got most of them. 100% specificity. No mistakes, no false positives. Good, better, but on admitters only. Now, I understand empirically why he would do it. That would be the first step. And once you can do it, before you bother trying to test it with deniers, it makes perfect sense to try it with admitters first, just to make sure that you're basically doing everything correctly. But there hasn't yet been the next. It hasn't been done with deniers yet. And so Ponsetti, again, tried the whole thing, again using faces, tried to replicate his own finding, and again replicated his own finding, but was only able to do it, again, with a sample of admitters. Good start, but next. Okay. So really the question then is,
what kind of cookies are those?
Good ones, evidently.
well, oh, there's another spice in this one. Teasing. Okay. So when we talk about how good does a test have to be, unfortunately, we still think in a very dichotomous way. It's a good test, it's a bad test. The test works, the test doesn't work. I pay attention to it, I don't pay attention to it. Now, in many of our circumstances, especially in a forensic context, that makes perfect sense. SVP, not SVP. Mitigating circumstance, not a mitigating circumstance, and that's what we're into. That's what we're looking for. But numbers are continuous, not dichotomous. I like this slide because it gives me the grays between the black and the white. For some purposes, just a minor statistical association, a basic correlation, I can use that in research. It tells me about populations, it tells me about what variables go with other variables, it gives me clues about what to look at, but I can't say any particular thing, any specific thing about any individual person. One of my favorite examples, again, just for reasoning through how the statistics work, if I say, here's a group of 100 people, here's a group of 100 people, this group is 1.5 inches taller than that group. Which group are the men, which group are the women? Very simple, taller group men, piece of cake. Here is a guy, 6'7", here is a person, 6'7", male or female. Can't tell, it's just the size of the group and the distinction between them. I can use it for research purposes, I can distinguish the groups, but I cannot use this for a clinical purpose. It's just not accurate enough for me to say anything with any kind of certainty when I'm talking about an individual person, even though the same inches of difference can be very important when I'm talking about whole groups. I can use it for research, but I can't use it for a clinical purpose. Or even in courtroom, I need even stronger evidence before I can use it as courtroom evidence. So the validity of phyllometry, again, depending on exactly which test you use, is about 72% in the earlier studies, again, 61% sensitivity and about 95% specificity. Now, what would happen if I had to test with this much accuracy? What would I then deduce about when I have somebody who comes out with this probability of being pedophilic as opposed to a 60% probability of being pedophilic? Or vice versa. In which of these circumstances do I feel comfortable Pick your example. Giving the guy custody of his kids back. Giving him his job as gym teacher back. Right, take your pick. I have one level of, all right, I know I'm missing 25% of them, and here I'm probably not missing anybody. Usually all we get is phallometric test indicates pedophilia or not. Well, this test indicating pedophilia or not, I would interpret in a completely different way from this test of pedophilia saying pedophilia or not. But how many people could actually say tell you what the sensitivity and specificity of their particular test is? Most of us just have no fucking clue. These are either, turnkey kinds of kits where we're just kind of following the manual, but nobody's tested it. And we are ruining and not ruining people's lives on the basis of, I don't know if it's this or this. And then, of course, we get the theoretical possibilities. What if it's super accurate? Do I now start using test results on a test like this for courtroom kind of evidence? Not the answer to any one of these. Okay. Again, the way with a lot of numbers, because people, do often get the it works, it doesn't work kinds of studies. Part of my graying is to, give an idea of relative to other basically familiar tests, how would this work out? So if I have a test way over on that side, again, just turned 50, did a little exam of prostate, not in the good way. But the sensitivity and specificity of using that as an early detection screening test is about 53% sensitivity, 84% specificity. Not fabulous. 50%-ish. We're literally getting fingers up our asses for a 50% chance of finding anything if it's there. Now how willing are you to get the annual checkup? I so shouldn't tell this joke. It only just hit me. It was about, let's say this is the men's equivalent. If women get a pap smear, men get a... I'm glad somebody got it. Explain it after coffee. Okay, the glucose tolerance test, that's a basic screening test for diabetes. Same thing. The sensitivity is about 60%. Somebody's obese, somebody's, dropping sugar, experiencing symptoms, and so on. They get a glucose tolerance test, and the test only picks up fewer than 2/3 of the ones who actually have diabetes. Right. Somehow knowing the accuracy of medical tests that we take for granted as, but the test said I have, but the test said I don't have. Tell me about your test. The rapid H1N1 test, one of the HIV screening tests, not in too much use now, 50%. It will only pick up 50% of the cases. If it says you have HIV, you have HIV. The sensitivity, the specificity is very, very high, but it's not particularly sensitive. Half the people with HIV who take the test come out as not HIV. Right, we take these tests assuming that, oh, it's a test, period. No. It's a test, comma. Or it's a test, M dash, now tell me the rest of the... But we generally don't even think to ask about how accurate whatever test is. Never mind the kinds of tests that have the implications that phyllometry has, and with the relative inaccuracy that phyllometry has, and that its validity is usually based on admitters rather than the clinically relevant situation of it being based on deniers. And the real HIV test, the one where they do take blood, highly, highly accurate, over 99% sensitivity, over 99% specificity. That test you can pretty much take to the bank. That whenever that one's wrong, there's an article in the paper. So when we go from one end to the other, where does philometry have to fit in order for us to be comfortable using it for whichever of these purposes? From just research purposes, way on my end, where I'm just looking for epidemiological patterns, up through I get to say something clinical about this person that will change, even end their life, versus something I could even use in a courtroom. So the philometry of deniers works out, about here, 72%, again, depending on exactly the test, and 95%-ish sensitivity. Compare that to the Sartorius study, the one that just looked only at emitters, and the one that only looked at, guessed at which part of the brain. For that part, it's not far from random. Philometry, however, is very, very good, relatively. So when somebody asks, can we use fMRI as a phallometric test, we ask it as a dichotomous question, but really all of these questions are continuous questions and continuous answers. It's how comfortable are you with a test of this accuracy level being used for this purpose? That's really the question. When put relative to familiar tests, what we're able to do with MRI technologies for detecting pedophilia, research, sure. Clinical purposes, not there yet. Philometry, there are some people who would have a legitimate debate. Now, if one is using the fMRI study, but just looking at the data from emitters, they can look like they're doing even better than philometry is. But the only reason that they look, But the only reason that they look like that is, again, the philometry, the numbers I'm using here anyway, are from the deniers rather than the admitters, where people who are, giving the other numbers are giving the numbers relative to admitters, which again, for some research purposes, that can be legitimate, but for our purposes, really, we need to make all of this relative to the deniers. Show that already. So as a bottom line, we're getting there. I wouldn't be surprised if we made it, but the thing that needs to be changed is, yep.
Where would you put the able on that spectrum?
Oh, that's a good question. I would have to see the exact numbers, but going just by the basic structure and the design of it, I'm not an able fan. Does that mean I'm disabled? I'm not a fan of the able. I'm not a fan of the able. It's too transparent and easy to manipulate. Really, it takes a lesson. It's easier even to manipulate. I shouldn't describe the phallometric test as easy to manipulate, but the evidence suggests that each time a person takes a phallometric test, they quickly learn how to manipulate it. With the able, all they need is the warning for how to respond ahead of time, and there's not a lot we can do about it. So, and the validity data, again, for it are not particularly impressive. But I would have to pull out the particular studies in order to give it a good specific location in my degrees of gray. Degrees of gray. When am I thinking? You're going where I'm going. I just forgot that I can't produce the word. Thank you. Evidence. Oh, right. So there's nothing technologically that we're still missing from being able to get fMRI to be able to do to be able to give data that we can use as philometry. But the number one thing that has to be fixed amongst my people, the scientists, are drop the fucking emitters. I know they're easy to test, but you get results that just aren't going to tell us anything practical. That's the first thing that has to be changed. It is indeed harder to do. Nobody knows that better than I do. However, that's the only way we're really going to be able to find out just how accurate we can make that kind of a test. So, as I say, we're getting close. That's pretty much where we are with the actual science of it, believe it or not. Where next is the other kinds of MRI technology that are still available and yet have not yet been tried. Magnetization transfer, NEAT, or magnetization transfer imaging, MTI. This is one where, again, when the brain is in a magnetic field, it's in the magnetic field. When you take it out of the magnetic field, it retains some of that magnetism. The different tissues in the brain also absorb different amounts of that magnetism. Stuff in the water, it's water. It jumbles around. It doesn't absorb anything for very long. The rest of the tissue does. So by listening to the echo of how much magnetism gets retained, we again get different kinds of information about the structure of that tissue, underneath it. Functional connectivity, we've now started, and we now need to take the next step to see if we can do that with deniers and with the kind of stimuli that can really, really help us to distinguish the different pedos from non-pedos. Independent replication. So far, even though the white matter finding is the only finding that's been replicated, and it's now 4 different papers, but 3 are mine. And this one was indirect. The Popel study, which used archive data and found a pattern that agrees with mine, but nobody has yet taken, an independent group has not yet taken sample of pedos, sample of controls, do any one of the things that I did, which worked, to try it again. People are, my frustration, as you can see, is that people are trying to simplify the research design to make it more doable, but in the simplification, they're dropping the utility of but they're getting published. I was waiting for another call for a rant. And another study I would absolutely, even the pedophiles who hate me would love to see the kind of a study, to do a brain scan study of the non-offending pedophiles, of the Dunkelfeld folk, of the people who come in on their own with a, "Doc, I got a problem," and start asking questions. I would love to be able to do a study with them. Because now that would be the other way around disentangling, what in the brain is about pedophilia and what in the brain is about a propensity to offend. One was to get 2 groups of offenders. The other one is to get 2 groups of non-offenders, only one of which is pedophilic. There are still some complexities in that. My guess is when somebody does run that study, and I do believe it's a matter of time, long time, but matter of time, when somebody does try to do that, I would not be at all surprised if the pedos who volunteer for the study are way better than average. This is not going to be the average this is not going to be an average pedo. I don't think that this is an average kind of person. I mean, a typical person is not going to come out and admit to the single most stigmatized thing on the planet and say, "Oh, sure, sign the consent form and come do it for the $20. That's not going to happen. The people who do it are going to be the ones who are very motivated. They're activists when they're in their own community, or they're, super extroverts, who don't care what, anybody thinks and are willing to sign up for such a study. Fine, but I have no reason to think that those people are going to be representative of regular pedophiles, and I don't have an equivalent way to pick my control sample to be self-selected in the same kind of way. This group, the pedos, will be self-selecting because they're very strong. That's the only reason they would come in. But I don't have a way to get that kind of mentally strong folk as my controls. So I'm hesitant, but would not be surprised if I found out that the pedos actually came out better. I would love to do that kind of study. The other one, I couldn't tell you what's going to come out. What if we did porn-only offenders? So these are people who are a little bit in between. They are controlling themselves enough to not touch the kid, although I don't know if that's not touch the kid because they know it could harm the kid, or it's not touch the kid because they're more afraid of the punishment, or they don't think they'll get away with it. And the porn offenders are just as pedophilic, but, they're letting themselves break some of the rules, although again, you're the last people I have to tell, they often talk themselves into believing this isn't as bad as it is because the victim is now an indirect victim from their point of view. So would I see identically pedophile brains with the hands-on offenders versus the porn-only offenders? That would be my gamble, and that the only differences between the two would be the general criminality that makes one group willing to touch the kid and the other group willing to come down the slippery slope, but not to the bottom. after the break. They are good cookies, I promise. Now that I have had the chance over an obscene number of years studying sexual deviance, you kind of can't help but start wondering, how all this ties together. I mean, is exhibitionism just kind of its own one thing? Pedophilia is its own one thing, and so on and so on. Are these all completely independent phenomena, or are these just different expressions of one single underlying problem that explains all of them? I think that's a fascinating question. Now, one of the parts that I often, and I have to keep, that I often remind other people, and I have to keep reminding myself, we've never tested other paraphilias. Of all the stuff that I and the Germans have found, how much of this is about pedophilia specifically, and how much of it is about paraphilias in general? Would I get exactly the same kind of findings if I looked at, for example, cross-dressers? People who are sexually aroused, men who are sexually aroused in women's shoes or underwear or want the entire anatomy, whatever. This only looks like pedophilia because I've only tested pedophiles. For all I know, if I tested other kinds of paraphiles, that I would find that they all have exactly the same, or very tightly related, deficiencies in white matter density in the tissues that cable together the sex response network. That would be perfectly rational, and that they differ in how they express this atypical sexuality only in some detail. Quite possible. Also, we often divide these according to which paraphilias motivate sex offenses versus which ones are just kind of eccentricities. And the eccentricity that I often use is cross-dressing. No victims involved, person can do it completely on their own, can live their entire life cross-dressing in secret, nobody will know the better, and have a perfectly reasonably happy life. So really, my question is pedophilia one of these very many things, or do they cluster together somehow? Another possibility is maybe just the paraphilias related to age clustered together. Mike Cito produced a wonderful word, the chronophilias. Pedophilia, hebephilia, ephebophilia, teleophilia, gerontophilia. Could these all be, clustered that way and distinct in turn from the other atypicalities? All possible. This was another one of those, 3 in the morning, wait a second. I got to write this down before I forget. The only ones for which we have a lot of information so far are pedophilia and hebephilia, thanks to exactly these studies that we have today. We have all these other paraphilias, the fetishism, vorophilia. These are the people who want to be eaten, swallowed whole. There was even a case, German again, where a guy actually was committing suicide. He found a sadist. He found a cannibal. Arwen Muse was his name. Fed himself, and the cannibal kept chunks of this guy in his freezer, and he ate him piece by piece. They videoed the consent of the victim, of the consumee, consenting to this for the consumer. I don't know why anybody studies anything other than sex. Europhilia, just what you think. Acrotomophilia, somebody was mentioning during one of the breaks. Acrotomophilia are people who sexually prefer amputees. They are more attracted to amputees than they are full 4-limbed bodied people into. There are also people who are into being the amputee. And now and then in ERs, physicians will talk about somebody who comes in tying one limb off to cause the gangrene in order to force an amputation. People will lying across train tracks so the train coming through will sever a limb. These people, they read porn about amputees, being amputees. There was a case, both a cross-dresser and an apotemnophile. She would sit in a wheelchair, she has 4 limbs, perfectly able to walk, would sit in a wheelchair, sitting on one leg so she would look like she was missing one leg. She was turned on by the idea of being looked at and treated as an amputee. Some want to be the amputees, some want sex with the some want sex with the amputees, some want sex as the amputee. Fuck, this stuff's fascinating. For pedophilia, the flip also works. There are people who are pedophiles. There is also, for lack of a better term, autopedophilia. They want to be the kid having sex with an adult. Like in an extreme form, diaper fetishists. And then some are into, you know, toddlers, infants, and but some want to be that kid. They will hire, you know, very large prostitutes, or it's easier to have the fantasy that they're being mothered by the physically large figure. They will wear adult diapers. You know, sometimes they will find a big bottle. It seems that for every one of these unusual sexual interests, there's a corresponding want to be that thing. My grandmother used to say it all the time. She had no idea how right she was. For every pot, there's a lid. Now, what is it, however? This is a clue. If every one of these unusual interests has its corresponding, they want to be that unusual thing, is that coincidence or is that a clue? To me, it's a clue. What if there's a part of the brain and all it does is say, look for it or be it? And in just that switch, it's all of those things get controlled. It's like, it's very easy to imagine 3 dimensions. Male, female, you want one or the other. You know, adult, child, one or the other. And look for it versus be it. And in just those 3, we have covered a large chunk of all of the sexual interests, including the paraphilias. So it's the, now for men, look for women versus the, anyone want to guess what Blanchard's word was? Autogynephilia. So controversial it's become because it's correct. Now, if we had never seen or observed it actually happening, if we never observed autogynephilia actually happening in people and people describing it, we should have predicted it. If the acrotomophilia goes with that, if acrotomophilia exists with apotemnophilia, if the, you know, if the wanting amputees, you know, coexist with wanting to be the amputee, if being attracted to kids goes with there being people who want to be the kid, well, if there are people who are attracted to women, shouldn't we also find people who want to be the woman? That's one of, not the only, that's one of the things that appears to motivate male to female transsexuals, autogynephilia. They are attracted not exactly to other women, although they will say they are, and they're often married, but they are mostly attracted to the idea of being the woman that others are attracted to. And that's what motivates roughly 2/3 of the cases of male to female transsexualism. The other third, completely unrelated. The only thing they have in common is they sign up for the same surgery. The motivation is completely different. The other group of male to female transsexuals are essentially gay men who are so gay, they really are happier living as women. Completely unrelated to this other group. This group, they make me look butch. They were easily identifiable as cross-sex interested in childhood. They had same-sex friends. They preferred, you know, girls' games. They preferred hanging around with other girls' toys, and so on. And when they come out as gay or transsexual, everybody's, yeah, surprise, surprise. This group, you would never have picked off the street. They look perfectly typical from beginning to end. And when they say that, you know, in their 40s very often, that they want to switch sexes, it stuns everyone because they are so typically masculine. And when I say typically masculine, I mean no natural female aesthetic. They, you know, will put on, you know, dress. God, big bushy beard, hairy, looking in the mirror, he thinks he's hot. No natural aesthetic for it, completely unlike the ones who are so gay. They really are better off being women, and happier and very successfully so. Yep.
Is that uniquely male?
Autogynephilia? Yes. Which is one of the things that people try to use to say it's wrong, even though to me it's part of saying that it's right. Now, For the male to female transsexuals, some are so gay they really are better off being women, and some it's a paraphilia, autogynephilia, that just draws them uncontrollably. It really is overwhelming. It's overwhelming. Overwhelming enough to want to be castrated. That's kind of as overwhelming as a male feeling can get. But completely unlike this group. There does not appear to be an equivalent of this in women, in bio women. Again, to me, that's a clue. On this side, we do have both sides. We have bio females who are very butch, very masculine through childhood, always had very obviously male interests. They are always sexually attracted to, practically always, sexually attracted to females. So when they grow up and say they want to be a guy, again, nobody is surprised. And these two, any way we can measure, seem to be the exact, not composite, that corresponds exactly to the other. This group, this only seems to happen to men, just like all the paraphilias. So again, to me, that it doesn't happen in women is one of the clues that it's a paraphilia. The paraphilias only seem to happen in men. My pet theory is that something goes different during the masculinization of the brain. So it only happens to bodies that go through at least some of that masculinization process. So women are immune. They don't go through that process. So we don't get autoandrophilia. Although there are some borderline-ish kind of people who just like breaking rules and will claim it, but there's never been any decent research really to suggest that it's true for real. So we've ended up, of the transsexual female to males, all basically so lesbian, they're happier being men, have a good time. For the female to males, there are these two different kinds, and they politically hate that. They don't want to be thought of as just as good as women, or a paraphilia that makes them want to live as women. They want the science to say they are, goddammit, women. They don't want it to say just as good as, deserve. They want the science to say that this is a female brain and a male skull. Well, we've done the brain scans. It's a male brain. Sorry. But that's not what they want the world to think. So they just call one scientist after another, myself included, transphobic, discredited, whatever thing they can come up with to try to discredit the scientist. But it's like listening to Fox News. They just say what they want people to think, whether it's accurate, just doesn't matter. Yep?
What are the gender differences in the brain?
Ooh, excellent question. Interestingly, one of them is white matter. Female brains have more white matter. Female brains work more as a cohesive whole in general than male brains do. In male brains, left and right seem to be more distinct. They function more independently. There are differences in hormonal control, and the other major differences are some are larger, some are smaller, mostly in motor areas. There are some other subtler ones. Oh, language areas also. And I'd have to hit my notes to remember the others, but those are the major ones. And they're not remarkable. They're not surprising. They are the brain areas that go along with the controlling the areas in which we see male and female behavioral differences. So they're not surprising, but they're interesting, even though they're interesting. And homosexuality, unlike the paraphilias, homosexuality seems to be associated with what's called the fraternal birth order effect, FBOE. Again, it's another one of these subtle epidemiological things that nobody on the planet would notice, except Ray Blanchard. Genius. The man was a genius. Is a genius. Retired genius. The man is a retired genius. Got it. What he figured out, pure accident. He just tripped over and said, oh, that's funny, but then found it again and again and again, and in every sample checked, there it was. Gay men have more older brothers than straight men do. Right, that's exactly what everybody does. Huh? Why? He did it in adoptees. Where in the birth order they were adopted, doesn't matter. If somebody was adopted into the sibling, doesn't matter. If there are older sisters, number of girls that came through the mother, doesn't make a difference. Number of previous children the father had, doesn't make a difference. Number of children mother produces after the gay one, doesn't matter. Only the number of male fetuses that came through the mother's womb. That's it. That's the only variable that's associated with it, and they've tried every other associated obstetric problems, length of pregnancy, every combination was tried. The only thing that matters was how many male babies came through that womb before the gay one did. And as usual, I'm an exception. I'm the oldest male and gay. My younger brother, gay. When he came out, I'm the oldest. He came out a couple years after that I did. We're three. Number three is girl, and my sister, our sister. So when my brother came out, our sister went into our parents' bedroom, hand on her belly. She was maybe 14, said, "Well, I know what my job is." She's produced three. She's done her job. Right, so this generation is where reproductively zero. We've neither grown nor shrunk. My sister compensated for me and my brother. They're a funny family. Actually, my sister's family is not unlike modern family. Right, when you think, okay, crazy sister, crazy one, one daughter who's a brain and the other two not, and then, can you imagine 4 gay uncles? Right, because me, my brother, and each of our partners. So, to the 6-year-old, it's just, the uncles are coming. I kid you not, we got a shout out, and I think she was 16 years old. They had her journaling in school, and so one of the things, we got a shout out that her uncles, UNKLES, were coming that weekend. Okay, finishing it. Oh, right, so it only seems to be the number of male fetuses that come through the uterus. What Blanchard then figured out, hypothesized, and has now essentially been as close to demonstrated as I think is possible. It seems to be something, again, not about the kid, something about the mother. How could the mother's body know how many male fetuses were in it in order for the next one to be more likely to be gay? That means something in the mother's body has to have changed such that it's interacting with each next male and only male fetus. As I said, dude's a genius. Blanchard.
Does that correlate the other way with straight guys having more sisters?
No association. Other stuff?
I remember at some point Quincy saying something about twins in position in the uterus related to.
Oh.
Yeah, do you remember that?
I don't remember him saying it. One is always dominant over the. That happens. Oh no, most of this would have been after that. So what Blanchard deduced was, what in the maternal body, remains or changes such that it would be there to affect the next fetus coming through. Again, it's one of those, once he figured it out and said it, we all went, the immune system. The immune system. Female fetuses have 2 X chromosomes just like the mother. Male fetuses, and only male fetuses, have a Y chromosome, which is foreign to the mother's body. Each time she is exposed to the various proteins that come off of the Y chromosome is an opportunity for the mother's immune system to react against them. We can take it a step further. What's the purpose of the proteins that come off the Y chromosome? It masculinizes the fetus. If the mother's body is starting to neutralize some of these proteins in charge of masculinizing the fetus, you get a homo. So with each male fetus, her immune system either reacts more or has another opportunity to produce these. The proteins were found. I think that they were the protocahedrons. A gene has now been identified. A maternal immune gene has been identified. Right, so we are well on our way to actually identifying the specific chemical chain of events that he predicted just by gay men have more older brothers on average. Right. Fascinating. It's fascinating. But there is no effect on birth order for any of the paraphilias.
Choose that immune system.
Well, they can choose whether to smoke. Funny you bring that up. Funny you bring that up. It also explains why there does seem to be some evidence of homosexuality running in families. Not because homosexuality, evolution should have taken it out a long time ago. But evolution would not take out a healthy immune system. It just seems like the homosexuality is a side effect of having a particularly strong or sensitive immune system. So it's the superior immune response that is maintaining the chemistry. It's just that the chemistry also sacrifices about 2% of the kids to be unlikely to reproduce. But in a population level, it's worth it for the stronger immune system in the siblings and cousins. It's just one of those fascinating. The stuff is just fascinating. But because none of this stuff happens in paraphilias, that's one of the things that's in completely non-politically. It's not because, which of these are socially acceptable or not. It's a completely different chemical soup that produces homosexuality than produces the paraphilias. They're both about sex. They're both atypical sex, but the chemistry in the brain that's involved in this is completely different from the chemistry in the brain and the DNA that's involved in this. Thankfully, this time science says something politically correct. Homosexuality is not one of the paraphilias. But I'm saying it because of the basis of the science, not because, who wants to be associated versus not associated with whichever one of these atypicalities. So, homosexuality is in the mix, but it seems to be a dimension unto itself. Okay. The other thing that I've been looking at for the past couple of years is hypersexuality. Again, I'm a clinician. I just, look and listen to whoever comes in the door telling me, whatever kind of problem they have. And in the past, 10 years-ish, 15 years-ish, of course, this one has just absolutely exploded. Together with for a couple of reasons, actually, one of which is online. The relative ease of online porn, I think, is one of the things, but not the only one. Now, I had a week off over Christmas, and what I do over weeks off over Christmas is work. So what I did this year, it was one of my favorites. I took a stack of all of the hypersexual patients that we had coming through the clinic, and I could tell that they were clustering. There were things that I was seeing over and over again. There were things I was seeing over and over again, even though they were a very heterogeneous group. So all I did is take a stack of roughly 100 different cases. I sorted them. I resorted them. It was time to think. Most science happens between Christmas and New Year's because I'm not getting any emails. And all of a sudden, same thing. And just all of a sudden, the piles, it's like they built themselves. All of a sudden, the whole thing made sense. Once I saw how these symptom clusters went together, I couldn't unsee it. I could not help but every time I ran into another client, I immediately knew which of these clusters they belonged to. When I describe these clusters to clients, they say the second one, and they could identify it themselves immediately. I'd put these out in a paper. All the feedback I get, yes, that's exactly what I see. Except that everybody's gotten so bent up in sex addiction versus myth of sex addiction, we've done what we do a lot. We've forgotten the patient. We've gotten lost in our own academic debates about it. These are the clusters I see. The top one. If I have given nothing else to this, if I have given nothing else to this field except this idea, this would be the idea. Avoidant masturbation. We see the basic phenomenon over and over and over and over and over among people who refer to themselves as sex addicts. These are people usually who will spend hours and hours and hours a day, surfing porn and masturbating. Well, they say they're masturbating. Mostly they're surfing porn. And as I say, hours and hours and hours. They're not getting their homework done. They're not getting their regular work done. It's interfering with their day-to-day functioning. Okay, that's a pretty decent definition of an addiction or of a mental illness. The part that hit me was that what most people do are, oh my God, so much sex, masturbation, it's pushing out of their lives everything else. We have to help them suppress the sex. Backwards. Their problem is not that the sex is taking them out of the rest of whatever they're supposed to be doing. They're procrastinating. These are people, some homework assignment, something, some chore they don't want to do. They sit down at the computer and they just surf porn for a minute before getting to their work. But people who are anxious about completing the job or don't want to do the job, the minute becomes half an hour. And the problem is not that the sex is pulling them out of the work they have to do. It's they don't want to do the work they have to do. But to distract themselves, they need something which is a powerful enough stimulus to help them forget what it is that they're supposed to be doing. That's why they're surfing porn. Suppressing that isn't going to solve the problem. If we address the thing that makes them anxious, the thing that they're avoiding, this no longer has any purpose, and it goes away. We address the anxiety surrounding the thing they're avoiding. So even though we're calling it sex addiction, we're just calling it an addiction just because it's a behavior that we want to reduce. And these days, any behavior we want to do less of, we just call an addiction. But it's not. The problem is they have some kind of thing that they're procrastinating. As soon as I tell a patient that, they start telling me, they agree in an instant, and then they start giving me examples of all of the other kinds of things that they procrastinate out of their lives, and the other things that they do in order to facilitate their procrastination. So even though they come in looking for a sex guy, they need an anxiety guy. Luckily, my husband specializes in anxiety. You can only imagine my partner and I, we've been together now 27 years, God help us. We're only just now starting to see the same patients because I'm only just now starting to see these patients. Weird. To send somebody to your partner? Weird. Well, for us, it's weird. Okay. The other group, completely unrelated to the first set. Again, I just kind of call them paraphilic hypersexuals. These are people who kind of, for lack of any other description, it's kind of like they have every paraphilia in the book. Anything vaguely flesh-colored will get them. Male, female, older, younger, don't care. They're turned on it's as if, the entire hot versus not circuit is broken and just responding to everything as hot. I can understand why they would call themselves a sex addict. Everything is turning them on. They find themselves masturbating frequently, because lots of things are turning them on, but completely unrelated to the almost always plain vanilla kinds of porn that the avoidant masturbators use. Chronic adultery. This is another one that I get in the clinic a lot. It's one where almost always a man, affair after affair after affair. Fine, and very often this comes in. He's sometimes unhappy, sometimes not, but he's not unhappy about the things that he's saying. It's something else making him unhappy. And very often this is the wife sending him in to go fix his problem. Well, the fact that the two of you haven't had sex in 5 years might be in the mix, you think? I need both of them in the chair. I've also get people whom I call the designated patients. These are one where, oh my God, you're masturbating? That's sick, go get help. And I end up with him in the couch because she has a zero tolerance for his masturbation. I got the wrong one in the chair. But he agreed to it. He knew this was her requirement. And I have also been fascinated by the reasons that I get via the husbands, from the wives via the husbands. He says, she says, but that's all I have. Sometimes it's their anti-pornography for pure feminist reasons. This objectifies women. She's not going to have any. She's not going to have any of it. But I also, sorry, that should have been on the left. On the right would have been religious objections, also very common. So it's kind of, well, I understand their points of view, but one, for me, it's extremism, left, right, blue, blue, red. It's kind of like, and at the extreme ends, they have both fallen off the edges of the earth. That extreme and that, they're both crazy. It's kind of like they've both fallen down and kind of, met on the far side of planet crazy. I want a t-shirt that says this: moderate is the new radical. Right, if people just kind of bend themselves into more and more extreme and kind of, now they're just listening to themselves talk. Anyway, so I see each of those different kinds of phenomena, completely unrelated to each other. I have a pretty good idea of what to do with each one. For some, it's psychoeducation. For some, it's helping them come to grips and learn to appreciate and embrace whatever their sexual interests are. For some, it's dealing with the anxiety and the procrastination. For some, it's relatively routine, if I can say that, couples therapy. For none of these is an addiction really. None of it's useful, none of it tells me anything about the patient, it doesn't tell me about the etiology, and it doesn't tell me what to do. So why are we arguing over whether it is or isn't? Mostly I don't care. If it's something that somebody can put on a form because that's what gets the insurance company to pay for it, all right, fine, it gets the person in therapy. Are they really an addict? Like any of us know what an addiction is. We just kind of go along with it. Okay. So, and the other group that is now starting to come around, and we're hearing more about, are the asexuals. Now talk about a group I know nothing about. There's very, very little published. There's very little published about them. Many of them, I doubt if they are genuinely asexual in a meaningful way. It's impossible to distinguish. It's very difficult to distinguish an alleged asexual from somebody with just a low sex drive. Or somebody who just wants to be special, they're a little bit, borderlining, or what we were saying earlier, access to, and they just want to pick some fancy label where nobody's allowed to question them. Okay, all of these are sitting in my head at one time or another. Until it just kind of hit me, rather than these being completely different things, there was a way to blend them together. What if this, hot or not brain detection system, was composed of, and almost all of the brain works like this, a dual opponent process network. There are neural networks in the brain that just kind of, take all the input available to that cluster of neurons, and if the pattern matches how it's set up, it then sends the response along the cable. Simultaneously, there is also a suppression network. In fact, most of the brain is suppression rather than activation. It takes down the close but no cigars. This looks for, look for two eyes, a head roughly in this proportion to a body, but not too close, or it's an alien, but not too big, or, if it's that big, it's a baby. If it's proportionate like that, it's an adult. So it suppresses the close but no cigar responses. And as I say, almost every neural network in the brain works in this pattern. What if something was wrong in the balance between these two neural networks? What if the network that normally suppresses the close but no cigars, what if it were malformed and it permitted things that normally got suppressed, then this attraction to children, which normally would get dampened or channeled into nurture and avuncular instincts, instead is being permitted to go and trigger the sex response network. Each of the individual paraphilias could be a miss of the suppression half of the network to suppress the unreliable or unneeded combinations. But what if that network were completely missing and didn't suppress anything? What would you get? Paraphilic hypersexuality? Now, what if it were the other way around? What if this were overactive and it suppressed absolutely everything and nothing got through? What would you see? In one stupid pattern that we know is the dominant pattern for how the brain works, I've explained the entire fucking list. I can't be wrong. I can be wrong, but if I were going to come up with a theory, it's simple, it's straightforward, we're observing everything we should be observing, and we don't seem to be observing much that the model wouldn't account for. I have no idea if it's going to turn out to be true. I just hope I live long enough to find out whatever clever kid actually demonstrates it. So the basic idea of pedophilia being in the brain brings us back to this. It sure the fuck looks like it's in the brain. I mean, once I've shown pictures 3 times in a row with every technology I attempt, there it is over and over again. The exceptions being, studies that are exceptions are, a third the size. So, the obvious explanation is whenever they're not seeing it, it's because they don't have the statistical power. Can we treat it? Nobody's yet found a way. Nobody's yet reported a way, except there is the occasional Fedorov who thinks that they found it, unless you correct their math. But there's nothing in the cabling stuff that we've seen in the brain that suggests an ability to change. People do correctly point out that the brain cannot heal. That's now only 99% true instead of 100% true. There are some exceptions. Unfortunately, people are often going the other extreme and saying nothing in the brain is permanent and everything is plastic. No, that's not true either. Early in development, everything is very plastic. Later in development, not so much. The best example, the best metaphor analogy, the best analogy I have is that when it's still batter, I can take this cake and make it into a chocolate cake. After it's baked, best I can do is pour chocolate sauce on it. I cannot turn it into a chocolate cake. Is it in the genes? We haven't yet found any direct evidence of there being a gene for pick your paraphilia that seems to get passed from, in this case, father to son. No evidence for any of that. The best evidence would be one of these indirect kinds of things, that there is something that goes on in the family analogous to homosexuality, where there's some indirect gene which perhaps is promoting the continued existence of this behavior, even though there's nothing in the behavior itself that makes the person more likely to have children. So if it's there, we haven't found it. There's no evidence to suggest it. And if we do eventually find anything, my guess is that it's going to be an indirect side effect of something else. Were they born with it? If they weren't born destined to be whatever the interest is, they seem certainly to be born with all of the ingredients. There's no good way to tell if this just kicks in at puberty, or if it actually starts at puberty with merely the ingredients in place, and it could still go either way over the course of childhood. It's quite possible that everything I found is not a marker of pedophilia as much as a marker of risk of pedophilia. Does it run in families? As I said earlier, this has been difficult to disentangle because for so long we've had the abused-abuser hypothesis explaining that there does seem to be abuse going on from generation to generation, but it's a mistake automatically to conclude that that's pedophilia going from generation to generation. Can it change? We've tried everything. From psychoanalysis to behaviorism, cognitive behavior therapy, everything. Nobody's been able to demonstrate a way to change pedophilia into non-pedophilia, except for the occasional people who just kind of say, selling Dr. Fedorov's miracle elixir, unless you test it. Are they responsible for it? Again, the division between, responsible for pedophilia and responsible for child molestation. They're responsible for their behavior. There's nothing to suggest, barring overt psychoses and, brain damage and genuine neurologically based disinhibition, no evidence to suggest that they can control that. No evidence to suggest that anybody picks whatever their sexual interest is, whether it's pedophilia or any of the other paraphilias or homosexuality. Can we prevent it? This is another one where sometimes the evil pedos go after me because, I suggest that as a possibility, and it is a possibility. Could there be something from early second, late first trimester that we can detect and say, instead of having a 2% chance of being a pedophile, this kid has a 15% chance of being a pedophile? Do you keep the pregnancy? Right, I got no good answer for that one. Does that count as prevention? Is it something where, amniocentesis, we find some cell, oh, no, we have to do whatever kind of psychosurgery, in utero to prevent it? This is where I use my scientist get out of ethics jail free card. I'm just a scientist. You decide how to use the information. I'm just going to tell you what's possible. Now, these have been some of my favorites, both from each of the wings and from society all over the place. The idea that pedophilia is in the brain and not something that somebody is responsible, unlike child molestation. Everybody who hears that, exactly the descriptions that people keep giving me after watching iPedophile, just over the course of those few minutes, you can just feel their worlds turning upside down as they realize this turns upside down everything that we've been taking for granted about pedophilia and had to treat it and had to deal with it in society. Now, the media have been all over this shit. It's a shame that I hate publicity. Really nothing? Yeah. The media have been all over this. It's just good science and it's important, but it is also just such an attention-grabbing topic that, everybody, oh my God, this is important. And the media do often recognize where this can lead for prevention and do see that the conversation that it can lead to. This, of course, has been, as I've said, has been made wonderful inroads into many different parts of the world. It hasn't been broadcast down here, but I think it's available now on iTunes, either iTunes or Netflix, one or the other. Oddly, the left wing and the right wing have reacted in unexpected ways. Well, I should say the right wing have... That's kind of how they respond to everything. It's like there was a sale on pitchforks, and so the red states just go. Now, what's strange is that I'm giving the same piece of information. They are born with it, they didn't pick it. Left, right. Same piece of information. They didn't pick it? Oh my God, that could have happened to me, sympathy. They didn't pick it? Well, if you can't cure it, you have to shoot them. That's exactly the conclusions. Well, they change their minds when presented with information. They use the identical information and come up with exactly the opposite conclusion. Can't be cured? Shoot them. Oh, not their choice? Sympathy. Boy chat and girl chat. Now I've described boy chat and girl chat, and there's another group called Before You Act. They're all in that same cluster, and these are the bad pedophiles. These are the ones who believe that it's the rest of us society getting in the way of the true, genuine, pure love that happens between adults and children and always has, and as I say, we're the bad guys getting in their way. As opposed to the virtuous pedophiles who appreciate the meaning of what their sexual interest pattern is, what it could mean for the kid, and swear themselves to a life of celibacy. The pedophilic offenders that themselves can't do better than this email. Hello, my name is David from approximately 6 hours away from my office in Toronto. I recently watched your show called iPedophile and was amazed, surprised, and grateful that there's a psychologist out there who gets it right. I'm unfortunately a man with a long history of sexual abuse that was perpetrated on me as a child and of which I then perpetrated on other children, mostly boys, as an adult. My first memories are of me at 3.5 and my grandfather. Though I was only 3.5 at the time, and I often wonder today if I wasn't the perpetrator and seduced him. Today I'm on parole serving out an 8 to 50-year sentence for sexual abuse against 4 boys ages 4 to 13 and 1 11-year-old girl. The longest case was one of the victims that I victimized for 9 years, his age being 4 through 13. I served 8 years in prison and 8 in my state's sexual abuse program. Though I had 2 very good therapists, a great COSA team, and an understanding and reasonable PO, most, if not all, think that my condition is something that could be managed by simply ignoring it. After seeing your program, I finally got the courage to have a serious talk with my PO, trying to explain that that approach just isn't right for me. It took a while, but I now know who and what I am. I am a man who is extremely attracted to prepubescent boys, and that I always have been. Even when I was a child, I did everything I could to seduce my friends and almost always managed to do so. I've learned how to manage myself, but I found that if I simply try to forget that side of myself, I start to think about heading down very dangerous paths. Unfortunately, Doc thinks I should just be able to fill my head with good thoughts, stay away from boys and temptations, and we'll be fine. I found that didn't work for me. I wish I did have a boy doll like you talked about in your show, but found stories in adult comics with young boys with masturbation seems to keep me under control. Well, I've already taken up too much of your time, so I'll end it here and we'll say thank you again for all you've done. Unfortunately, being from the US and the rules governing our two nations, I realized I would never be able to talk to you face to face, so I thought at least I had to email you and say thank you for your understanding of guys with a problem like mine and keep up the great work. I realize you're extremely busy, but if you could find the time, I would love to hear from you. Thank you again, David. I was indeed very happy to email him back, and every now and then we do still keep in touch. So if I'm going to leave with a couple of bottom lines, does pedophilic differ from teleophilic processing? Nope. Same areas of the brain light up. The emotions they experience should be exactly the same ones that we do, including the affectional ones that we forget by focusing so completely on sex. Can fMRI serve the same function as a phallometric test? Theoretically. Now it's a matter of just getting the accuracy to where that of the phallometric test is. The overall features that we found in the brain so far all seem to suggest early prenatal origins. Pedophilic brain structure differs, but only differs slightly from routine brain structure, and the brain differences are not consistent with the changes that we know do happen in the brain. We do not grow new brain cells. New neurons do not populate the brain. And even if they do, they wouldn't know where to grow. They grow like vines, and they grow from where the original neuron is to wherever a other chemical signal is that the neuron brings itself to. Those signals only exist during brain development before birth, some during puberty. So even if we could just put in new cells, those cells don't know where to grow. So although in this science fiction-y theoretical possibility, sure, but we are way, way beyond, before that kind of a point. Brain differences are not consistent with what changes in surgery therapy or stem cell research, and pedophilic brains light up in the same patterns as the non-pedophiles, although of course they light up when they're seeing children rather than when they're seeing adults. This is my favorite slide of all. He was Jewish guy, World War II, Hirschfeld. He was the one who started really a lot of the modern gay rights movement. His work, of course, ended during World War II. Do you remember famous Kristallnacht, famous picture of a book burning? Those were his books. That was his library. Pure luck, he was out of Germany when it happened, and so he survived. I think he came to the U.S. after that. Anyway, what he said was just as true today as it was then, and it's always the thought that I like to leave people with, and that is the pursuit of justice, in this case, through science. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Studies been done, and if so, are there any differences?
Excellent question. The cross-cultural studies are tough to do because that's exactly when you start running into, is this a difference in the culture or is this a difference in their policing and their ability to apprehend and so on? And so because those are so tightly interwoven, there's no good way to unravel that. Excellent question, though. Yep.
Do you have any plans to start researching the other paraphilias to see?
Ooh, excellent. Do I have plans to start researching the other paraphilias? I'm collaborating with a couple of other labs that are, but mostly I'm consulting. I'm doing less frontline research at all now. I'm collaborating with a group in British Columbia. We're working on the asexuals, and we're working on a sample of people mostly with fetishes in Ottawa. Yep.
How do we get through the whole day without talking about priests?
Have a little priest, if you like it greased and you like it hot. Try the financier, peak of his career. Okay, I can't be the only gay man in the room. Somebody else has to have gone to Broadway, Sweeney Todd, Demon Barber of Fleet Street. Have a little priest. If you like a greased and you like a hot, try the financier. Mrs. Lovett? How about the Rear Admiral? With or without his privates? I can go all day. What else? Other stuff ready for wine and dinner? Oh, yep.
But when it comes to the difference between offending and non-offending pedophiles, is there any research that suggests that there are maybe significant differences, and I'll say things like impulse control or any like neurological differences that would point to they have the same desire, although I realize that's a spectrum as well, as to how strong they're aroused by it. Is there research that shows a strong...
Excellent question. I don't think anybody's compared head-to-head the pedophilic offenders with pedophilic non-offenders yet. My gamble will be, well, 'cause the pedophilic non-offenders are hard to get. My gamble would be that we would see exactly the 2 by 2. There are very definitely chunks of the brain, mostly frontal lobe, that are associated with criminality, antisociality, and sometimes psychopathy. And now we have these areas of the brain that are associated with pedophilia. I think this would be a very simple 2 by 2, that the pedophilic offenders will show both the brain areas related to pedophilia and those related to antisociality. People who commit crimes other than attacking children will show the antisociality areas, but will not show pedophilia areas, and then everybody else is, of course, control. That would be my gamble. But I don't think anybody's done the exact study yet. And it hasn't. Pretty sure it hasn't.
Clarification, iPedophile is available on Amazon Prime.
Oh, thank you. iPedophile is on Amazon Prime. If it does, I'll be the first to email. Yep.
Your second last slide said something about brain differences not consistent with what happens in, there it is. There would be surgery. That was what I was missing.
Got it?
So, is there any intersection, in your opinion, at all between the neuroscience with the stuff you just talked about and the neuroscience of addiction that is out there?
Oh, excellent question. I don't follow the neuroscience of addiction. I couldn't tell you. It's my guess would be that they are entirely distinct, but it's just guessing on my part. The big area of overlap, again, would be in the limbic 4F's area. But so much of the reward system is dopamine, but only a small fraction of it, touches the same part as the sex part, the rewarding pieces. But I haven't, and because the addiction parts, reorganize in their sensitivity with exposure, but none of the other sex part does. Again, my suspicion would be that they would be independent, but I don't think anybody's looked directly. And as I say, addiction really isn't my area, outside of sex addiction. Yep.
So, rearranging sensitivity with exposure, do you not think that we have some people that would never have expressed their pedophilia that are because they're being exposed to child sexual images through the internet?
Not quite following the question.
Your answer to her question was reorganizing the brain through the reward system through exposure.
Oh, with drugs, yes.
Yeah, and so one of the things that we've kind of approached pedophilia lately is that as people are exposed to child pornography through mass amounts of pornography use, that they can kind of heighten a sensitivity or a heightened awareness of pedophilia that they wouldn't have normally.
Oh, yeah. No, there's no evidence for any of that. And if we were going to guess, we'd be guessing in the opposite direction. First, the chemistry is completely different. I mean, when one is taking an exogenous substance, and putting it in, it hits everything. The part of the brain that's sensitive to it responds to it, and that's that. Sex is an endogenous set of reward, is an endogenous reaction. is an endogenous reaction. The brain cannot produce more chemicals than the brain can absorb. It's designed to reabsorb its own used dopamine, I will call it. Also, it works in the opposite directions. Taking more of a drug does not make a person more sensitive to it. They become less sensitive to it. That's why they have to take more of it. A person would not, so that would argue, if there were an analogous mechanism with pornography, they would be becoming less pedophilic, not more pedophilic. They would be becoming less sensitive to stimuli depicting children rather than more to it. And again, there doesn't seem to be any evidence for any change in that whatsoever. The other part is that sex, unlike, drugs, cocaine and so on, the really direct dopamine ones, the reward system in sex, dopamine is involved, but the dopamine is released secondarily from a hormone called oxytocin. It's the same chemical that in the female body, milk letdown, giving birth, and both in male and female orgasm. Now, one of the funny things about the neurons that produce oxytocin is that they both produce oxytocin and they have oxytocin receptors on the same cell. So it responds to itself. It shuts itself off after it releases the oxytocin. Remember your last ejaculation?
Hell.
The system shuts itself down right after it's used. So again, which is completely unlike drugs where you can, where overdosing is possible. Again, with an endogenous substance is completely different from the brain releasing its own substance and responding to its own substance. But there's no evidence to suggest that viewing child porn or whatever changes a person's sensitivity to it. In general, if somebody's watching child porn, I can pretty much bet it's because they're into child porn. The child porn, so otherwise they're watching it motivated by what if they're not already motivated to watch it?
I've been told it just pops up.
I watch a lot of porn. Let me detail that. I've been hired on a case to review the perpetrator's porn stash. How's that for a day job? So there I am, clicking through somebody else's porn. Turns out he's into she-males. If I can go through, these people's and I'm not getting child porn is not popping up. Oh, just checking.
That's just what they tell us.
I just have another clarification. So I've heard that, people who've been in trouble for watching child pornography say it isn't that they're interested in child pornography, that it was that latter, that I started with vanilla porn and then I upped the ante, and it wasn't because I was sexually attracted, but because there was the rush. And that's where I'm looking for clarification between the rush of an addiction, right, and sexual attraction.
Yeah. I hesitate to say anything about any particular case, but the first question in my mind, the first interpretation I would give, it wouldn't be that they got that rush, therefore they're into it. It's they got that rush because they were into it, and they just finally got a really good sample of what they're into, and finally I get whatever it is that they want. So to me, the latter was a ladder of daring themselves and testing themselves. Exactly, and so it was successive approximation rather than they were exposed to it. And oh my God, child porn is so hot. Anybody looking at it is going to become a pedophile. Yeah, right. If gay men cannot become straight by watching straight porn, right. Yep.
So you said earlier about females not pedophilic, cannot have pedophilia.
That's what it looks like.
That's what it looks like. Because we were talking about women who identify as having pedophilic interest. And have you done any fMRIs and MRIs? Have you studied women who have child victims and or self?
Excellent question. Let me start with the basics. Women aren't like men.
Really?
Yeah, it's true.
I keep saying we're more alike than we're not.
We'll talk. As I often point out, the female sex response system is not nearly as visual and object focused as the male one is. That's not a surprise to anybody. To men, hot, not. For women, on average, the desire for sex emerges out of the nature of the relationship. Always exceptions, of course, but by and large, that's the nature of it. So even if and when something is off with the visual part of the sex attraction system, the rest of it is still working. The expectations for the future, what will my friends think, all of that is still intact. So if one component of this multi-component system is off, the rest of the system can compensate. In men, if the visual part of the system is off, that was the whole system. I'm exaggerating. But that's basically, that appears to be a large chunk of it. Now, women, there has been invented a female equivalent of the phallometric test. So instead of being a ring that the man wears on his penis, instead it's a small light diode that the woman inserts. When she lubricates, that reflects back to the diode different amounts of the light that the diode is giving off. So the diode just pulses a little bit of lead light, and then the amount that's reflected back is a reflection of the lubrication and blood engorgement in the vagina. So it's the exact same test, and it does beautifully differentiate watching porn, not watching porn. Now with men, I show the men, with men, I show the men, I show the women, and they react to whichever one. Show it to women, they react to both. Gay, lesbian, bi, they react to both. The female system does not seem to respond with the specificity that the male system seems to respond. So since females don't seem to be as specific in the first place, the question is moot whether they're specific for this incorrect thing as opposed to specific to this correct thing, because they're not specific to begin with. Or at least not as specific to begin with. What? To me, that's, no, I find that actually a very pro-feminist line. It's that women are not obeying their hormones. Women get to decide. See? It's that we're men, hot, not, and there's not a frickin' thing we can do about it. Where for women, there's the, context. Later they find they're attracted to somebody that they didn't, experience attraction for. With women, it's a much bigger, complicated.
It's like Billy with the God, we had read that. There's a place in that where they talk about the authors talk about it.
Oh, yes. Yes, I love that book. I love that book. Ogie Ogas and I forget.
Fudd and Miss Marvel. Yeah, the Magic
In that,
I don't know, ending on a word like magic hoo-hoo is kind of hard to beat. So here's our fMRI DTI scan of the hoo-hoo. Oh, right. So because women don't seem to differentiate the way that men differentiate, the idea, can there be a female pedophile? Right, the question is kind of moot. There's no law being broken if one is, but the basic structure suggests that's just not, it doesn't seem to happen. There are, of course, female child molesters, but my first, diagnosis to explore, well, first, second, and third diagnoses to explore are all personality disorders.
What about female hebophiles?
Same cookie. Both males and females have the range of ages that they will that they prefer, like or don't like, but the basic principles are the same. It's relatively unusual for a female brain to look at a body. This does not look like the kind of person who will be able to produce for our children. So it's unusual to be attracted to that age, but that someone would be attracted to that a woman would be attracted to any specific age is it's the whole specificity part, not which age they are specific to.
in the attraction to both in women, wasn't there also a significant kind of, what would you call it, cognitive dissonance or denial on the woman's part of being aware of that? I'm thinking about
Oh, after the test.
Women will say, well, like for a man who objectifies, will say, oh, you're a pig. You know, but when you say, well, I think that you could be aroused to just bodies too. And it does seem sincerely less
A woman denies
aware.
being, a lot of women are attracted to visual nature of men's bodies. I mean, even you have Jermaine Greer saying women need to reclaim that right, and publishing the book Beautiful Boy and all that stuff back in the 90s, you know? It's like, I don't know. I think that that's off to say that women don't have like a visual thing they do with men in terms of attraction.
Get
Oh, no, we do. Oh, no, we objectify.
No, I wasn't
Don't
asking.
we, don't?
If you were to watch a video.
Yeah, I wasn't asking that.
He's now single.
Granted, I pushed the sex differences, further apart, in order to be able to contrast them. But by and large, on average, this is as bimodal a phenomenon as we are going to be able to get to see. So are there no exceptions? No, of course there are exceptions. But as a basic phenomenon, okay, people have dinners to get to. People have magic hoo-hoos. Well, half of us have magic hoo-hoos. Thank you again. Take care. Have good drives back.